Alright, welcome to part 2 of Fruhead's Beginner's Guide to Mapping, where today we're going to go over the audio side of things. So choosing your song that you want to map to, and then getting the audio file ready in order to take on and then go through the rest of the mapping process. So let's head on over to the BSMG wiki, head on over to our members resources, and then the audio editing resources. So this one is broken apart into 2 guides. So the first one is the basic audio setup, where this one is going to go through all those basic generic getting started steps. So how to choose a song, how to determine the BPM of a song, how to determine the offsets, and then go through all those steps of getting that file ready. Whereas the advanced audio editing, this is for more in-depth techniques of editing a song down to make it shorter, or how to deal with if you do have a song that is variable BPM, and some tricks to get that sorted out. So hopefully, depending on the song you choose, you should not need this advanced audio editing guide yet. And today we're going to focus on the stuff that's found in the basic audio setup guide. So we head on over to there. And as a general rough idea of the stuff that you're going to be needed to be doing is first downloading and installing Audacity. So hopefully you guys have already watched the first video. If not, head on over to this link, go to this website, and then get this programming set up and ready to use. First, click download, go through the setup, install it, boom, you're all set up. So once you have that, and the next step is figuring out what the BPM and offset of your song is going to be, how to verify the BPM of your song, how to generate and introduce an amount of silence into your song, how to check your song's volume, and how to make it either louder or quieter if you need to, and then exporting your song into the correct format to then take off and then use in our mapping editing software later on. So the first thing we need to do is actually choose a song in order to a song that we actually do want to map in the first place. So when it comes to selecting a song, especially as a first-time mapper, there are a couple of key things you want to keep in mind. Namely, you want the song to be a really clear, obvious standard beat that you can easily identify which sound is which instrument, and then what the beats of are those sounds. And then hopefully that those beats is a nice, good, consistent speed and tempo. And then the song is a little bit on the shorter side. So when it comes to basically the clear beats, you want this, like I was saying, you want it to be clear and obvious enough that as you're listening to it, you can easily pick out the stuff you would basically, clap your hands or tap your foot to. And it'll basically make it easier in order to actually go through the mapping steps of what those actual beats are. In terms of tempo, you want it to be nice and consistent because it'll be a lot easier to deal with in terms of mapping. Now, most songs, we'll just generally, speed up or slow down depending on what the actual feel of the song is at a given point. But for most standard songs, they just tend to be, changing what the notes are they're using. So basically, instead of, using, quarter notes, they might, move up to using whole notes instead to make you slow it down, or they might, basically move it down to eighth notes to speed it up. But it's still the basic, some multiple of the same BPM that was already present throughout a song. So then, as for in terms of length, you can basically think about in terms of a nice good rule of thumb is that for every 1 minute of a song that you have, it's going to take 1 to 2 hours to actually map out that 1 minute of a song. So the shorter it is, the quicker you can actually get through the process. Now, in terms of a player, most players basically have a nice set range of what actually is a good level for the play. So basically, most good maps tend to be in the roughly 2 to 3 minute range, where actually that's where most players are actually looking to play a song for. So now, if you're looking at songs that are a little over 3 is okay, but once you start pushing 4, 5, or 6 minutes, most players are only going to really play that map if they already like that artist or they already really wanted to play that song. So if you do care about actually getting a lot of people to play your song, ideally, you want to stick close to that that 2 to 3 minute mark. Now, as for those other issues, I would basically talk about, in terms of the beats and the tempo. So, like I say, most genres of songs do tend to be nice and good and consistent, but there are some artists that do kind of, do get a little bit more complicated. So, one artist I always like to reference, it would be Camellia, where their tracks tend to be really complex in terms of sound and time signatures, where they're, using a lot of BPM changes, where sometimes they might start at 150. And then bump it up to 198, and then down to 147, and just these odd, weird BPMs, as well as using really funky time signatures that they might use 4/3 or 5/7, and it's just I swear this person hates rhythm mappers. So yeah, you kind of want to avoid those because again, the more complicated and complex the song is, the harder it's going to be to time and the harder it's going to actually go through the mapping steps. So as a first time map, do definitely stay away from those. Now, if you really do want to map stuff like that, like the joke here is, map all 17 minutes of Inagata Vita, you totally could if you really want to. But again, you're making it a lot harder on yourselves as a first time map because if it's 17 minutes, using our rule of thumb, you're looking at 17 to 34 hours to get this mapped. That's a long time. Plus, also older songs tend to have just natural BPM drift since human beings are not computers, and that BPM will just kind of slightly drift over time, and it's going to be really hard pain to time that out. So, yeah, just try not to do that. Like I said, some with a clear, obvious beat, something that is consistent, and something that is short. So for this the tutorial series, the song I will basically be using to walk you guys through this is the NC release version of Raven and Crane's track Biscuit. So this is a track that is relatively simple. It's really obvious to hear the sound of the beats, and it just sounds nice and fun. So all right, we now have our song that we selected. So now comes step 2, actually getting the song file to use. So if you already have the song file, okay, you're set. But if you don't, there's some things you want to keep in mind. And then if you already do have the audio file, check on with these steps, make sure that you actually have a good audio file. But when it comes to getting the actual file, you want to pick the highest quality source you can because it's going to make your life a whole lot easier as a mapper. So the higher your source file quality is, the more crisp it's going to sound, the more obvious it'd be easy to pick out the different sounds of the song, to be able to identify what sound is what beats, and it's going to be a lot easier to time because of that. So ideally, if you can, try to find either a FLAC or WAV file for your song. This is what's known as a lossless format, where it is the highest studio quality file you can possibly have. Now, if you cannot find one of those, a very close second would be a really high bitrate MP3 or AAC. So these are one of those lossy formats. So you do lose a little bit of quality compared to the FLAC or the WAV, but not really a whole lot for our purposes. And you could really only hear a difference if you are a really distinct audio file where you have really good ears. You can easily pick out those differences. But for the general player population, they're honestly not going to notice, as long as like it's mentioned, it is a decent high bit rate to start with. So ideally somewhere around 200 or higher KBS. As long as at the high bit rate, it should be good to use. Now, some people, as they first get started mapping, we've seen a lot of questions, people asking, well, why can't I just rip it from YouTube or Spotify? Why can't I just do that? There are a couple problems with this. So problem number 1, this is technically piracy and song theft. If you just do like a YouTube rip like this. So we generally try not to advocate song theft. So that's kind of a bad thing to do. But especially as for a mapper's use, basically streaming it from either YouTube or Spotify, they tend to be streamed at a much lower bit rate. So because of that, it's going to be a much lower quality file. So if you just were to rip it like this, it's going to be really, it's not going to sound that great, and it's going to be really hard to hear those differences in terms of the instruments. It's going to be really hard to time because of that, and it just makes your life a whole lot harder to deal with. Plus, the volume of the song is also not going to be right, so you have to go through a lot of extra steps to make this file work. So you really only want to rip a song from YouTube or Spotify or something if you have, honestly, absolutely no other choice. As for where you could find it, really any place that you can purchase digital music will be totally fine. So, like Amazon Digital, iTunes, the Google Store, even an artist website or their artist Bandcamp page, they tend to have those good audio files there. Any of those sources would be a nice, good, legitimate way to actually get one of these song files. The song we'll be using for the NCS releases, they're actually nice people, and they actually do have a free source you actually can get these songs from. All right, so now we have the song file. Now comes the actual big part of this, actually getting this file ready to actually be edited in our mapping software. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what the actual BPM of our song is. So option number one, this is the option that me and most mappers use all the time, is a program called Aero Vortex. So hopefully you guys have already downloaded that. But if not, we maybe you kind of just follow the links here. In order to actually use Aero Vortex, we want to have our song file in this OGG format instead. So before I show how to use Aero Vortex, and before I show you, I need to show you how to use Audacity first. So we will come back to this step a little bit later in the video. But for now, if you don't have it, basically follow these links to get it. If you do go to the main Aero Vortex website, this website does tend to have issues where a lot of times it's constantly down all the time. So over in the mapping Discord, we actually do have a zip file already uploaded to this Discord server. So all you have to do is just head on over to the BSMG Discord, click on this link, and then you'll basically get the zip file of Discord of Aero Vortex, and then you just unzip it like any other file, and then you'll be good to go. But for now, we will come back to using Aero Vortex later. But let's say if you don't have Aero Vortex, how else could you determine your song's BPM? So one option is Google. So if you just basically were to type in, the song, the song name and the artist, and just Google what the BPM is, you would be able to find out the BPM that way. So one website I like to use is songbpm.com. So all we need to do is just type in our song file name, which was Raven Crane Biscuits. All right, and so while I'm doing the search, it is telling us that our BPM is 128. So that sounds about right. So most songs do tend to have a BPM around 120-ish, maybe a little bit above, a little bit below. So that looks good. Now, a lot of times you don't want to only use one source as your BPM. You do want to check it in a couple places to make sure they're all are telling you the same value. So another website I like to use is getsongbpm.com. So for this one, just like the other one, we can actually just search the song. It'll tell us what the BPM is. But they also do have an in-browser song analyzer. You can basically upload your file, and it'll tell you what the BPM is. So all we need to do, grab our song file that we just downloaded, drop it on over. It'll do its thing. Hey, it also says the BPM is 128. So it does match that first source, which is looking good. A final step you can take is using the website all8.com and actually manually tap out the BPM yourself. Now, for me personally, I'm not that good at tapping out a BPM. I tend to be fluctuate a little bit because, again, I'm not a computer. So as I'm tapping, I tend to be a little bit inconsistent. So I personally don't trust myself with this. But again, if it is an option we can do. So all we need to do is just play our song and just tap along to what the actual BPM is. So we'll let the song play. Click in this little box. Then we'll move our cursor out of the way. And then we get ready to start tapping. So we want to listen for something that sounds like it's on the actual beat of the song itself. Namely stuff like drums or clapping. So there's the claps. And you want to let this go for a little bit so you get a nice decent sample size in order for it to actually analyze. All right. So after doing this a number of times, we got a BPM that is roughly 127. So it was kind of close to 128 after trying this myself a couple other times. I actually was able to get 128s. But like I said, I am not great with tapping out a BPM. So I can see this one is a little bit off from these other two, but it's still in the same rough general guideline. So this does look decently okay. But like I said, I am not great with tapping out the BPM, so that's why I tend to trust those programs a little bit better. The other issue is that, as you're noticing, we're getting an average BPM with a decimal. This rounded to a nearest whole number. If you were to look up on these websites or any other website, all of these are also going to be rounded to a nearest whole number BPM. So for most modern music, most of those tend to be corrected to an actual nice whole a whole number like this, so you'll probably be fine. Other tracks, though, also that might be a little bit off, depending on how the song was mixed or sampled. So it might not be an actual whole number BPM, which could make things a little bit harder in the end. So that's why I said I personally use Error Vortex a lot of the time. But for now, we do feel pretty confident that our BPM is 128 or is a value near 128. So we have our BPM all nice and good and sorted. So we'll head on back on to the next steps, getting our audio file ready for our mapper. So for this, we're going to be using the program Audacity. For Audacity, there's only a few things we need to do. Namely, basically need to generate silence in order to shift our audio file a little bit so we don't get what is known as a hot starts, and then convert it to the file format we need. Those are really the only two steps we need to do. There are a couple other things you might need to do, like I mentioned before, where we might need to either increase your audio's volume or decrease your audio's volume. But as long as you had a really good source file to begin with, you should not need to do those. But just in case at the end, I will show you those steps if those do end up popping up. So the first thing we need to do is grab our song file and just drag it on over into Audacity, and it'll open up right there. So this is what I mentioned before. This was known as the waveform of our audio file. This is basically the actual sound of the song in a nice mathematical form. Which if you're really good at reading this, you basically pick out what is which step. Basically, the higher it is, the louder, and then the softer it is. So what do we need to do using this? So, like I mentioned before, if you want to use Error Vortex, we need to have this in what is known as the OGG format. This format is also required for our mapping software later on. So let's say, for example, if we want to go back to using Error Vortex to figure out BPM, how do we get it into an OGG? So all we need to do is click on File, Export as OGG. So we click on that. It basically tells us what we want to name it as, the file type, and this little slider bar down here for quality. So this quality bar is basically just there to determine what quality we're going to export this OGG as. This will not, however, add more quality than you actually have to start off with. So if you had a really low quality file to begin with, you can't just magically export it as 10 and get quality back. That's not going to work. It's basically going to basically take whatever you have and then change it down from there. So ideally, when you want to start off as high as you can, but the higher your quality, the larger your file is going to be. So when we actually go to upload this file later on to share it, we don't want to have the file be too big. So a lot of times I'll basically decide some of these higher audio qualities and then adjust as I need to. So for now, let's start off with 9 because I know where this is going. And then we will save this as a quality 9 OGG. This next thing that pops up is basically a lot more song info. Honestly, we don't need to basically change any of this. Just leave it off as is. And then we'll go down to click OK. Let Audacity do its thing. And we now have our OGG ready to go. So, like I was saying, depending on the quality we use, it's going to determine the size of our audio file. In this case, about 6.5 megabytes. So for me personally, I try to keep my audio files roughly around that 5 megabyte range. Because again, we don't want to have these files be too large because then we might run into issues later on when we go to share them. Plus, again, if we have a lot of really large audio files, that's going to use a lot of server space on Beat Saber's end, and then that becomes a problem. So 5 megabytes, that's a decent range. So for example, if you exported at 10 quality, you got something like 11, 12 megabytes. You might want to bump that down a little bit. Basically, kind of go step by step until you get something that's a bit closer to 5, 6 range, and you'll be good to go. So we have our nice OGG file ready to go. And now, okay, we'll go back to figure out BPM, and we want to use Error Vortex. So when we are using Error Vortex, the problem is we want this to be an OGG because there's a little bit of delay that pops up in that conversion process going from an MP3 to an OGG, and that delay tends to be around roughly 30 milliseconds. So as we're going through all of our timing process in Error Vortex, ideally we want it to be an OGG first because it's going to make our life a lot easier in the end. So we got our OGG, we got Arrow Vortex. So all we need to do is just drag it right in, and there's our song. So if we were to push space, it's going to start playing. If we were to push F3, it'll turn on a beat track. So now, if you listen, it sounds off time. You're really gonna, if you really pay attention to the claps, you'll notice it. So the beat ticks are not lining up with the beats. So what we want to do is click on tempo, head on over to sync mode, and then adjust sync. So now, right now, it's basically defaulted to 120 BPM, and then okay, let's find out. But notice though, it didn't sound correctly. If we were to click find BPM, it's going to do its little computer thing, and hey, look at that! It calculated the BPM is 128. If we click apply BPM, notice a couple things happen. Number one, it did change the BPM. This beat grid realigned. Number two, it gave us this music offset value. So this music offset is basically realigning the grid to a different point in time in order for our mapping purposes. So the problem though is, as a player, when you're playing the song, you want to avoid what's known as a hot start, where as soon as you click play in the game, boom, your audio basically starts right up and you're immediately bombarded with blocks. So if I were to click play right now, so notice that, say if I wanted to map those quick drum hits, or maybe these vocals in here, they started almost immediately as soon as the song did. Ideally, I don't want that to happen. So what we want to do is change this music offset value. I tend to adjust it until I get an offset around 2-ish seconds. So that'll give it to the players a couple seconds to basically get ready before they start here, before they ever hear it. So now we have a little bit more time for when that first block would actually appear for the player. But now that we have the offset and BPM sorted, let's check our timing again. So now in this case, once you start hearing those clappings, make sure that the clap and those drums are kicking off with our BPM ticks. So if you listen, you can hear that every other beat tick, you're hearing the clap alongside with the beat tick. And now in this section, you can't even hear the tick anymore because it's perfectly in tune with the clap and being drowned out. So now just to be safe though, you want to check towards the end of the song as well to make sure that it didn't drift at all. You see, towards the end, it still sounds like it's pretty much in line, so I think we're good. So now the question is, though, what do we do with these values? So this BPM, we're going to need this later when we actually get to actual mapping editing, the actual mapper editor. So for now, just write down this value somewhere so we have it for future reference. This music offset, this value we're actually going to take now inside Audacity. So now what we want to do is basically move our cursor right at the nice start of the song. Click on Generate Silence. As for how much silence, well, we're going to add this value. So music offset says 1.823. So we will generate 1.823 seconds of silence. Click OK. It's now shifted this track up a little bit, and it's actually added this silence at the start of our map. So if I click play, silence. And then our song picks up. So now the question is this correct? Well, we can basically now reuse Arrow Vortex to check our work. So once again, we will export this as an OGG, and I'll call it V2. Once again, not touching any of those settings. So now, I'll close out of this. And now, we'll put in the second trial we just made. So drag you on into Arrow Vortex. And then once again, let's try adjusting our sync once more. Find our BPM. Got the exact same BPM. Hey, it's also telling me a music offset of 0. Perfect. Now, sometimes as you are going through this process, these values might change a little bit. You might get a BPM that's 127.99. You might get a music offset of 0.001. Don't panic if that happens. As long as these values are still really close to this initial 128 BPM, and music offset is still really close to 0, we are okay. Something else that might happen is sometimes, depending on your audio file, as you click this find BPM and apply it, that happens. Oh, look at that. We have now another offset generated. But let's add 1 beat. Hey, it went to 0. The reason for that is once we actually apply this new this corrected BPM to it, it did shift this audio a little bit because, oh, there was this silence at the start. Oh, this shouldn't be here. And then it went back a little bit in time to try to get rid of it or try to realign it with the grid at some points. But by just basically re-adding that beat back in, our music offset was still 0, which is good. Like I said, this was not exactly 0, but it was still really close with like less than 5 milliseconds. You're most likely, for the most part, okay. Worst case scenario, we would just have to, okay, well, we'll head back into Audacity, adjust that silence a little bit, either add more, take some off, and then recheck it through a couple times until we get this to be close to or exactly 0 and close to or exactly 128 BPM again. But for now, this checks looks good. So we head on back over to Audacity. That file we just made is perfectly totally fine to use for our uses. But let's say if you were basically kind of following with the wiki, what if you had that problem where your volume wasn't quite right? How can I check my song's volume to tell if it's good or not? So this one, we're going to be using another value that is known as the analyze and contrast. So what we want to do is we either want to check the verse and the chorus or the actual loudest parts of our song. We want the quieter parts to be louder than -11 decibels, and the loudest parts to be quieter than 8.5 decibels. So to check that, all we need to do is there's our little steps. So we head on over to just click and basically highlight something of the song. So let's say this section. I'll do this section. So this was our nice part. So head over to Analyze, Contrast, Measure Selection, -11.18 decibels. This was our quiet section. That's in our good range. Our loud section, that was right about in here. If we were to analyze this, that's a little above, but for the most part, it's not too far above. So this, for the most part, this audio file should be okay. And like I was saying before, as long as you start with a nice, good, nice, high-quality audio file, you should be good to move on from this point without having to deal with the actual changing the volumes. But what if you didn't? What if you actually had to change these? So how do we change our steps? So we have our new wiki, changing the volume modifications of your song. So the tools you're going to be using is the compression, the limiter, and the amplifier. So step number 1, what if you have to compress your song? So what if your song was too quiet? What if you have to increase your song's volume? We're basically going to head on over to these steps. When it comes to using compressor or the compression, you might not need to use it if it actually is a nice good peak difference. So if you were to look at your song's waveform, if you actually do notice really nice good peaks in your quiet section, you should be okay. But what if you're not okay? So let's take a look at how to use the compression. What you want to do is inside Audacity, so we can see, make sure we see the menus. Head on over to the effects menu. Oops. Have everything. So basically what I'm going to do is double click the track, make sure everything is selected. Click on effects and then compressor, and we'll get this little dialog box to pop up. If you are really confused on what all this means, don't panic. All you need to do is make this screen look like this screen. So threshold, -12, noise, -40, ratio 3:1, tech time, 0.1 seconds, release time, 1 second, check this, and then click OK. Audacity will do its thing, and notice it changed a little bit more. We'll basically notice this quiet section, those peaks got a little bit higher. If we play that section, we'll make sure that we don't have too much distortion. Still sounds okay. Check our loud section. And it still sounds okay. So the compression came out good. Now step 2, we need to go through using our limiter. So this one, once again, all we need to do, if we have no idea what these mean, that's totally fine. But basically the goal is, if we basically were to highlight this section again that we checked before, click on Analyze. So right now it is still not good range, but what if we wanted to bump it up a little bit more, a little bit less? This is where this limiter is going to come up into play. So once again, we'll select everything. Click on Effects, head on down to Limiter. And once again, make this text box look like that text box. Hard limits. Start off with a 4. Start off with another 4. -0.1, 1, no. Click OK. All right. Now, as a final check, let's make sure that we didn't screw anything up. Now we go here. It does sound a little bit distorted. Let's check here. That definitely does sound distorted. So now I'll ask for, why does it sound distorted? Well, if we do our little analyze trick again, and check our contrast, notice that's now at -7. Check our loud section. That's now at -5. So in this case, it bumped it up a little too much. So in this case, we went too far. So all we need to do is undo, or Control Z, to undo that thing we just did, and basically redo this step again. But what we're going to do is adjust these input gains a little bit. They suggest about negative, basically go up or down by 0.5 decibels each time to aim for a value between 8.5 and 9.5. So if I check these quiet sections again, so it is close to 9.5, but I want to get this closer down to actually being 8s, right in the middle. So if we're actually smart about this, since that was reading at 9.3, let's try, oops, wrong one. So go back to our limiter. Instead of 4, let's try 1. Since again, I know where this is going. Whoops. Again, make sure everything is selected. There we go. So now it's been edited once again. Check our quiet section. Quiet section sounds good. Check our loud section. Loud section still sounds good. Now if we were to do our little checks once more, our quiet section, it's still a little high, but not that high. Our loud section, still a little high, but again, not that high, so this looks good. But let's go all the way back to our beginning of what if it was too loud. So if it was loud, this is going to have a different setup where instead of using the compression and limiter, we're just going to use amplify. So the way amplify works is we want our loudest part to only be 8.5. So now we have to do a little bit of math thinking. So if we check our loud section here, so right now it's reading at around 7. I don't want it to be around 7. I want it to be around 8.5. So when you figure out what is the difference between 8.5 and 7, it's around 1.5. So remember that value. This is basically where you need to do that math idea. So we figured out it's beating around 7. I needed 8.5. It's a difference of 1.5. We're going to remember that 1.5 difference. And what we're going to do is we're now going to use, you're going to use amplify. So to use amplify, all we need to do is once again head on over, first select everything, and over to effects, amplify, and that 1.5 value we just figured out is going to go here. Make sure you enter it as a negative. Oops, not that, negative 1.5. And then enter, and then it'll do its thing. This one tends to be a little bit quicker. So now, if we check out the loud section again, it's a little quieter. If I head on over to analyze our contrast, hey, 8.5, perfect. So now it is now nice and good and set. Now, there should never be a time where we actually need to do both at the same time. We need both need to make it louder and quieter. You should only need to fix one of them depending on what is the problem. So either, as you guys are going through the steps, focus in on this guideline. When you're checking the song volume, check either your verse or your chorus, and basically the quiet section. The quiet section should be above negative 11. Then if you want to check your louder sections, that should be below negative 8.5. So as long as your song is in those two ranges, you should be good. As for if you need to make it louder or softer, depends on what is your biggest problem. Is your song too loud, in which case you need to use amplify to bring it down, or is your song too quiet, and then you need to bump it up, and basically go through those steps. But in either case, once you are done, all right, so now let's once again export this all as an OGG, and we are done. So in this case, though, instead of calling it this, I'm going to call it song OGG. Once again, because I know where this is going, but for you, you can basically call it whatever you want. As for why I'm calling it song OGG, you will then see that in our next video. But for now, we'll just save that as our song OGG. Once again, quality 9, hit OK, and done. So now we now have our audio file all nice and set and ready to head on over to our mapping software, which we'll then do in our next video. So that brings us to a close, and I will see you in the next one.